Thanks everyone for taking part. We're really fortunate to have with us today someone who is renowned for his passion in teaching others about the challenges of those who identify both as members of the LGBTQ+ community and the developmental disabilities community, John Raffaele. John is a licensed master social worker and an experienced professional educator and trainer, specifically in the field of human services. John's graduate education is from Yeshiva University and SUNY New Paltz. Most of his education stems from his years of interacting with DSPs as the Director of Educational Services at the National Alliance for Direct Support Professionals, supporting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I really look forward to learning from his expertise today. Thank you, John, so much for being here with us. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Commissioner, thank you so much, and it's really an honor to be with you all. Very much so. Thank you, Tyler, for setting it all up, because left to me to figure out technology, we would be still sharing Post-it notes with each other. So Tyler, thank you. I'm going to share my screen, and hold on one second here. Right there, share. All right, does everybody see that? Hold on one second. I just want to get it. Is it looking good?
It's looking good. You just want to probably put it in slideshow mode.
Boom. How's that? Is that good, Tyler?
It's awesome. Thank you.
See, I told you, without Tyler, you'd be looking at probably my nostrils. Again, thank you, Commissioner, for that wonderful introduction. And my role with the National Alliance for Direct Support Professionals is one of, I'm the Director of Educational Services. Our whole mission at the NADSP, and we've worked very closely over the years with the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities in New York State, and have proudly done all kinds of work with you. And again, our role and our organization, which was founded by John F. Kennedy Jr. Back in 1995, our role is to elevate direct support professionals, bring them to the professional table, if you will. We're doing that. We do that through training, through certification programs, through policy work. But one of the things that we have been really focused on this last year, and for the next couple years, through a grant from the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council in New York State, we are working to help direct support professionals who work with people with intellectual disabilities who also identify LGBTQIA+, to help those direct support professionals with that process of supporting people who are identifying with LGBTQ+ life issues. Now, happy Pride Month. This is LGBTQ Pride Month. June is devoted to that every year, and it's a time to celebrate the part of the diversity of our human community that identifies as LGBTQ+. Next month, July, is Disability Pride Month. And again, a time where we look at what disability means in our society, and we look at, and certainly us in the disability rights community, we look at disability as just another wonderful component, another wonderful part of the diversity of humanity. But why do we have to have Pride Months for each of these categories of diversity? Well, sadly, we have to have Pride Months in some ways because of some negative history. I'm not going to belabor the negative history. And my role today is to talk about kind of the intersection of disability pride and LGBTQ+ pride. And there's an absolute intersection. And there's an intersection that can not only be, I think, helpful for us to understand, especially if we're supporting people with developmental disabilities who are also identify as LGBTQIA+ individuals. I think we need to understand both of those quote unquote subcultures, because indeed, disability, there's a culture, there's a disability culture, there's an LGBTQ+ culture, and that should be not only celebrated with pride, but understood, certainly, as we are professionals working in the human services. So that's what I'm going to do today. Just spend about a half hour or so talking about what I believe is some important components to the celebration of Pride generally, but also to the intersection of disability and LGBTQ rights. And I'm going to go right to that. 1964, in the United States, something monumental happened. The Civil Rights Act, right? The civil rights, all the civil rights struggles that certainly primarily for Black Americans through the 40s and 50s culminated in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act. There were other alienated populations that were also included in the Civil Rights Act. But what we saw, and I'm not going to, there's not a lesson or a discussion about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that's not the point. But what we saw beginning then was the recognition that there were people in our society who indeed didn't have equal rights, were discriminated against, up to and including heinous things were done to them. If you think about 1964 institutions were still quite abundant in the United States. In New York State, we had a bunch of institutions where people with disabilities, with developmental disabilities, were housed essentially, right? But in 1964, and then through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we saw all kinds of movements, wonderful social movements that ultimately, once again, proved and showed our society that people with disabilities, they have human rights. And also people identifying LGBTQIA plus have rights. Women have rights. People of color have rights. And we have been chipping away at that since probably the beginning of our history as a nation. And we're still trying to get it right, aren't we? In 2022, we still struggle with discriminatory practices, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in the supermarket, whether it's, in our own communities. We're an ongoing work in progress. But I think one thing that I want you to take out of today is that it did take a fight to get to this place where people with disabilities have equal rights to people without disabilities, and people who identify LGBTQIA plus have rights, the same rights as people that don't identify LGBTQ. I got this idea of the double closet from somebody that has been working in this field, supporting people with intellectual disabilities and people who identify LGBTQ. The double closet. When you think about this, closeted means hidden from society for maybe your own reasons why you want to hide from society, or the fact that society is just so unwelcoming, you do want to stay in a closet. We know that throughout a large part of our history, people with disabilities, as I just indicated, were put into institutions, taken away from their families, their communities, in I suppose the intention of keeping them safe, rehabilitating them. We had things called training schools, right? They were called training schools for people with disabilities. That was essentially our closet, right? We hid people identifying LGBTQIA plus. It wasn't until the late 60s, really early 70s, when the time came when people were more comfortable coming out of that closet of hiding, whether it would be in gay bars or in communities, speakeasies, whatever you might call it, where you could gather with people who identified with LGBTQIA lives. You couldn't be public, right? You couldn't necessarily be public in the 50s or 60s if you used a wheelchair, because we didn't have curb cuts to allow you to enjoy rolling down a street. And as you're going to see in my remarks here, this double closet is significant. So if you have a developmental disability, physical disability, if you have identification with LGBTQIA plus as an individual, you're in a double closet. You're in a place that even in 2022, people with that dual identification, they can meet, unfortunately, pushback, discrimination, and sadly other bad things. So this notion of the double closet is quite interesting, and one for us to think about. Obviously, in our world, the OPWDD world, I'm going to talk about the implications of this double closet and what we can do to help people. By the way, it's not our job to bring people out of a closet, whether it's a person with a disability or a person that's identifying LGBTQIA+. That closet can be a very protective place, by the way. But I'll get to that in a little bit when I give you some ideas about how we best support people who identify with both of these things. A little bit of Pride history. It was the exact date, June 28th, 1969, right down on Christopher Street in New York City. Started what was known as the Stonewall riots. The Stonewall Inn was a bar. There's a long history to it, but it was a gay bar, primarily men. But ultimately, it was there that basically the flint was struck, a spark was created, and what was ignited was largely the gay pride movement. Through all kinds of legislation, through all kinds of activism, throughout obviously the 70s and 80s, tons of openings in society became prominent for people that identified LGBTQ plus, and it became more of an accepted quote unquote lifestyle, which I don't know if you want to call it a lifestyle. It's not a lifestyle. It's who you are, right? It's who you're born to be. As Lady Gaga talks about "Born This Way," I love that song, man, because in that song, you're born who you're born. That's who you are. That's who you should be, and nobody should ever try to change that. And to reinforce that, you should be proud of who you are, whether you have a disability, whether you identify LGBTQI plus. I identify I'm a cisgender heterosexual man. Out of that, I mean, be proud of who you are. You're born that way. But unfortunately, we live in a place, in time, in history, in society where it's not so easy. When you go back to that double closet, right? A little bit about disability pride history. It's got a similar parallel, and it was July. I always forget the date. July. I got to write it down. July 26th, 1990. George Herbert Bush signed into law the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's by no accident that July is Disability Pride Month. And when we look at that trajectory, in terms of that subculture of our society, it was in the 70s that a lot of activism took place, interestingly enough, as was in the LGBTQ movement, the advocacy and the rights movement with that group. The parallels with disability advocacy were really very similar. A lot of activism in terms of meeting with politicians, meeting with communities, making sure that communities addressed and included people with disabilities, included people that were identified as LGBTQ plus. The 70s, the 80s, and by 1990, there was enough movement, there was enough, I think, advocacy, enough lobbying, where it took till 1990, but one of the most comprehensive disability laws was put in place in the United States. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is complicated. It's very complicated, complex, but basically, what the whole point of the Americans with Disabilities Act was to equal the playing field for people with physical and intellectual and mental disabilities. You can learn more about, obviously, the ADA just by Googling it. There's tomes and tomes of information. That's great. But July is the commemoration of the ADA, and July is Disability Pride Month. So I encourage you to do stuff for both LGBTQ Pride Month, and which is this month, and next month, Disability Pride Month. I'm going to read something which is very heartbreaking, I often get emotional when I read this. I'll try not to, but I can't guarantee. This is kind of the negative side of that double closet. For those of you that don't know who Caden Clark was, well, let me just read, I'll read you what I read when I do trainings every month. As I was talking about earlier, I do a training every month with two fellow trainers to primarily direct support professionals in New York State, helping them support people with intellectual disabilities and identifying as LGBTQ plus individuals. This story about Caden Clark, who lived in Arizona, is the ultimate negative results of not understanding this double closet and understanding the parallels and the support needs of people who identify LGBTQ and who are, in this case, autistic. Let me just read to you. This is a joint statement from, oh my goodness, dozens of organizations. A joint statement on the death of Caden Clark. We, the undersigned, disability and LGBTQ rights organizations strongly condemn the police shooting of Caden Clark, an autistic transgender man, in his home on February 4th, 2016 in Mesa, Arizona. Clark, who identified as having Asperger's syndrome, a diagnosis on the autism spectrum, was killed by police who were responding to a suicide call. His death was marked by a twofold failure of police and media to respond appropriately to mental health crisis situations, but to also respect the identities and experiences of transgender individuals. Moreover, videos made by Caden in the weeks before his death highlight the pervasive discrimination that autistic transgender people, there we go, there's the dual closet. The pervasive discrimination that autistic transgender people, as well as transgender people with other developmental disabilities or mental health concerns, face when seeking transition-related medical care. Let me just read on a little bit more because this really puts it in perspective. Caden said in his last video, because what Caden would do, he would post videos on YouTube about his transition process. And Caden said he was particularly devastated after a therapist, get this, told him that she would not approve his starting on the hormone treatment until after his autism spectrum disorder, which she referred to as a disease, was cured. Friends, this is not 100 years ago. This is about 5-6 years ago. Because autism has no cure, this amounted to a pronouncement that Caden would never be eligible to transition. Caden was frustrated that although his Asperger's diagnosis was included in his file, that the therapist had apparently performed no research at all on autism prior to meeting with him, which is just talk about a dereliction of duty, and declaring him ineligible for hormone treatment. In light of numerous suicide attempts, which are very frequent among LGBTQI plus individuals for various reasons, despite these numerous suicide attempts, Caden is described as related to his gender dysphoria. We cannot ignore the possibility that this failure to provide adequate care placed Caden at heightened risk of experiencing a mental health crisis, and the one where he was shot and killed by the officers was one where he was completely at a loss of self-control and was acting aggressive. I use that story, and it's a horrible story. You can read more about Caden. There's lots of things online, but that's where it comes to our responsibility to understand, I guess, where this intersection is and how it plays out in the lives of the people that we support. And some data. I'm not gonna go over each one of these things. This comes from the International Journal of Direct Support. These are statistics that come primarily from Canadian and United States Department of Justice figures and data. I'm sorry, there's a typo there, Tyler. I couldn't fix it. Sorry about that. But I'm going to read just a couple of these because I think they're significant given what we're talking about today at lunch here. 74% of people with developmental disabilities do not have knowledge of LGBTQ plus issues, and that 70% have been shown to have negative attitudes towards individuals who identify as LGBTQS. 33% of gay men with developmental disabilities have reported some kind of sexual abuse. It's a higher rate than heterosexual men with developmental disabilities. 75% of gay men with developmental disabilities have reported they've had risky sex, which is critical. I have various stories about people with intellectual developmental disabilities not understanding forms of protection when it comes to whether it's sexually transmitted diseases or sexual exploitation, so forth and so on. Here's the thing. I'm not going to read the rest of these just in the interest of time. You can find out these numbers, these statistics. You can go to the Department of Justice. There are all kinds of statistical numbers that are very scary when it comes to people with developmental disabilities. But then you add to that the added closet of, if you will, LGBTQ identity. You're talking a group of people that certainly need our alliance and our support. So let's get to some happier things, please, because this is a month to be happy. It's a month to be proud. When we look at that parallel journey between or among people that literally marched in the streets or rolled in the streets if you used a wheelchair in the 70s and 80s, people fought for their pride, and not only did they achieve it, but they achieved other outcomes. They achieved a place where I think the world now sees the LGBT community, the disability community, sometimes with some higher respect, almost reverence. We look at even entertainment, the media. The media now has much more out there about not only the history of the actual non-fictional history of both of these populations, but wonderful illustrations of being proud to be a person with a disability, being proud of your LGBTQIA plus identity. And when we look at, I think the parallel of the two movements, the one thing I'm always intrigued by, it took, I'll use the word natives, meaning people who were within that community, whether it's the LGBT community, the disability community, it was people from within their communities that ultimately affected change. We look at civil rights. Look at the civil rights movement in terms of Black Americans, African Americans. It was, yes, there were allies. There were allies of all colors, of all races, of all creeds. But it was largely people who were part of the community that was oppressed that had to be front and center, coming out of that closet and making it known that I'm a human being. I am, as the civil rights chant, I am a man. I am a man. I am a man. Well, also, I am a woman. I am a woman. I am non-binary. I am cisgender. I am transgender. Whatever that chant should be, it is, and it should be said proudly. And I think when we look at the evolution of where we've come in terms of a disability provider community, we have come a very long way, a wonderfully long way. We have a long way to go, I do believe. But that's another time, another lunch. But I think for right now, my assignment for you is to talk about being proud and the parallels of the LGBTQ pride movement and the disability pride movement. A little bit more into the what can we do? What can we do? Comes down to one word, I think: respect. Respect. And we don't have to agree with, we don't have to uh, completely understand the culture of the disability culture or the LGBT culture, but we have to respect those cultures because they are indeed cultures and they should be treated as cultures. There's a rich, rich history in the disability rights movement. Um, I recommend to everybody a movie. It features Judy Heumann. Judith Heumann is I mean, she's a fierce self-advocate, and it's a movie called Crip Camp. Actually, takes place down in Sullivan County, New York, where there was a camp that was for people with disabilities, and it's a documentary about, man, this was a rocking place back in the 70s. Oh my gosh. I mean, a lot of fun stuff was going on at the camp. What you wouldn't think would be happening with 200 people with disabilities. But man, they were rocking and rolling. It was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Watch that film, and you'll start to get a glimpse of the power of the subcultures of communities, whether they're communities of color, whether they're communities of certain ethnicity, whether the communities that are celebrating LGBTQ plus, disability communities. It's so wonderful to see those communities for what they are and understand as much as we can. Doesn't mean we have to completely agree, right? One of our primary roles, especially when we're talking about people with intellectual developmental disabilities, is to provide information and provide accurate information, not based on what we think, what we feel, but based on what we know, right? What we know as human services providers, what we know as direct support professionals, what we know as clinicians. What are the latest advances in understanding adaptive equipment and how that might support somebody uh, with, to have a life of greater ease and significance. What do we need to understand about supporting somebody who is questioning their sexuality, questioning their gender, perhaps? How do we best support that person? So maybe somebody like Caden, who wants to transition from one gender to another. How do we support somebody with hormone treatment and with surgery, perhaps? There's a lot to that. We might have to investigate. We're going to probably have to learn, but then we're also going to maybe provide information, right? I think the last thing we want to talk about here is judgment, right? And I think this can be a charged topic. I think people have their opinions. We're still seeing parts of this country that want to turn back the laws that protect people that identify LGBTQIA+, whether it's marriage equality, whether it's receiving medical services, for crying out loud. These are things that are happening. When you add that to our population, the people that we serve and support, people with disabilities, you're talking about that intersection where it can be very complicated, and none of you, myself included, none of us work alone. We're not on an island. We have resources, we have supervisors, we have peers, and we want to utilize that when it comes time to a time when we have to intervene and support somebody. One more thing, and I invite everybody to use this. It's the NADSP Code of Ethics, easily found. You go on to nadsp.org. It's probably in many of your offices. It's all around the country. The Code of Ethics I'd like to consider it a map, and it's a great equalizer. It helps us when we are maybe in a situation, maybe we're not understanding what questioning means. What is transgender? What does two-spirit mean? Maybe we're in a situation where we just don't understand. We're supporting somebody with a disability that's also part of the LGBTQ community as well, and maybe we need to investigate and learn about how to best support somebody. That might mean getting information, but it also might mean adjusting our understanding of our role. And our role is one of all of these things. I'm not going to get into the code, but for instance, justice, fairness, and equity. Hey, look, if somebody wants to get married and they want to get married to a person of the same gender, that's legal. That's legal, and that's just, that's fair. And if you're asked to help somebody and support somebody with that process of getting married, you better darn well find out how to best do that and best support the person to do that, because otherwise that's unethical and could be considered illegal. So and the list goes on in terms of how the code of ethics can apply to supporting people who identify in both of these camps, if you will. One other thing, person-centered support. We hear that a lot, right? I mean, OPWDD, putting people first, right? Person-centered support. What does that mean in the code of ethics? It's very simple, not simplistic, it's simple. As a direct support professional, my first allegiance is to the person I support. All other activities and functions I perform flow from that allegiance. Allegiance. That word it's one of my favorite words, because allegiance means loyalty. Allegiance means listening to. Allegiance often means following. And then we look at self-determination. As a direct support professional, I will help the person I support direct the course of their own life. Trust me, take a look at the NADSP Code of Ethics, and what you'll see is a wonderful map that can help you in not only supporting people with developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, but also supporting people who might be in that crossover. Some people that are experiencing and wanting to explore their sexuality. Be an ally. There's the root, the root of the word allegiance, right? Ally, allegiance. You don't have to be LGBTQIA plus to be in support and to be a supporter. And when we say ally, there's more to that than just contributing to a fund. It's showing up at pride marches. It's making sure that if you see discriminatory practices happening against the person with a disability, against a person based on LGBTQIA plus identification, that you intervene and you advocate with. That's alliance. It also means oftentimes maybe having difficult conversations with coworkers. Absolutely. So maybe there's somebody that you work with that doesn't agree with somebody being gay. Well, sorry. That not only is it it's a right, but it's something that we have to support and have to help that person explore. Another piece of the code of ethics is relationships. As a direct support professional, I'll help the people I support develop and maintain relationships. It doesn't say straight relationships. It says relationships. So, I could have a whole day with you on the code of ethics. But I gotta go. I invite you all to look at, come to one of our trainings. We have them every month. Hopefully next year we might even have them in person. But it's called Proud and Supported. And what it is, it's a real deep dive into what I kind of just talked about, but more so, how do we best support people with intellectual developmental disabilities who identify LGBTQIA+. And we're doing them. I'll show the dates, and you can if you do Proud and Supported, you can go to the website and you can find out how to register. They're all free, and again, all through a grant through our friends at the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. We're just so happy to have this grant and to be doing this work. So June, LGBTQI plus Pride Month. July, Disability Pride Month. Please celebrate it in some way, shape, or form, some fashion. I really encourage you to do it. There's nothing like a pride parade, whether it's disability or otherwise. And not only is it a wonderful thing just to experience, but it's also a wonderful thing to show your allegiance to a population of people that have struggled with equality and have struggled with identity. And you can be a wonderful source of support, and be proud all year long. Whoever you are, whatever you do, you are all human beings that are born this way. And we should take some time, especially in these very difficult times right now in our society, to just take a moment and reflect how precious human life is, regardless of our identifications and our labels. Our human life is a wonderful gift, and we should be very happy to have it and be honored to support people who happen to have disabilities and who might also identify LGBTQIA+. So with that, you get in touch with me, jraffaele@nadsp.org. go to our website, go to the Proud and Supported website. Our next training is June 22nd. It's a wonderful time to come, and I have 2 other great trainers that I do this with, and we go deep into this topic and this issue. So that's what I got, Tyler and Commissioner. I got some time for some questions, and otherwise, you know, we can finish lunch and go back to work.
Thank you so much, John, for taking the time out to present to our workforce. It's greatly appreciated and extremely insightful. I do not see any questions in the chat box. However, participants do have the capability to unmute themselves. So if you do have a question for John, please go ahead and do so. Okay, not hearing anything. I guess
That's okay. That's okay.
There is a comment, though, Tyler, that Sunmount DDSO in Tupper Lake is having a pride colored walk on June 28th. So that's something that we could share.
Beautiful, beautiful. That's a wonderful place to run and walk and whatever else and roll. It's beautiful up there. Excellent.
Any other questions or comments?
And again, you feel free to reach out to me if you want to, you know, if you have a private comment, or you give me an email, phone call, whatever you got. I'm available to anybody and everybody.
Well, once again, John, thank you so much for taking the time out, and happy Pride.
Oh, thank you. Happy Pride, everybody. And thank you, Commissioner and Tyler and everybody. Keep the
Thank
faith.
you.
Keep the faith.
Bye.
Thank you.